Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, February 20th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Welcome back, Jill.
Thank you, Moshe. I noticed that you really enunciated your name there.
Moshe Wanunu. Two names, even though I say it like it's one long name. First name, Moshe. Last name, Wanunu. For those who've been asking. Keep this recording on this February 20th, in case you're ever curious.
And we dare you to figure out how to spell it.
Oh, that's a whole different, that's a different can of worms. I mean, you could look it up online, but memorize it. Actually, Jill, funny story. I was a founding father of a fraternity chapter at GW when I was in college. And like is the tradition at many fraternities and sororities, you require pledge classes, the groups incoming, the incoming groups every semester or every year to memorize the names of the founding fathers or founding mothers, if you will, of a sorority. And I would be approached years later. I was like in a New York City bar and I talked to somebody and they're like, "Are you Moshe Wanunu?" I'm like, "Yes." They're like, "Oh my God, I was a member of AEPI, 20 years after you were in college." We thought they put that name there to test us, to mess with us.
It couldn't possibly be real.
It can't be possible. You have 6 vowels in your last name. We thought they were just trying to mess with us. You're real, and that's how you spell your name. Oh my God. Anyway. Fun little anecdote.
That's great, actually. That's when you know you've got a tough last name.
Well, these guys successfully spelled it, and years later I bought them a drink at the bar.
Okay, so it was all worth it.
There you go.
All right, let's get to the headlines here. The war of words escalates between President Trump and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy.
Yeah, it's gotten to the point where we're only halfway through the week, and Trump is calling Zelenskyy a dictator, leading to a lot of pushback here and around the world.
Meanwhile, some new polls show that Americans' confidence in air travel safety is down after the worst aviation crash in the United States in years. We look at the numbers for a reality check about how safe it is to fly.
Yeah, we're looking to bring you some confidence today in the podcast.
To driving, the Trump administration looks to end New York's first in the nation congestion pricing tolls, just as officials say that it appears that it is actually helping to cut traffic in the city.
It comes in an announcement that Trump made where he declared himself king. We'll explain that part.
Overseas, Arab leaders are brainstorming their own plan for Gaza, what it looks like. In business news, KFC is leaving Kentucky.
Is it just FC at this point? The K is gone.
And we'll tell you about the executive order that President Trump signed looking at ways to make IVF cheaper, what you need to know. And finally, attention parents, you probably have a favorite child, even if you won't admit it. A new study reveals why.
Jill, I only have one kid so far. You have 2. Are you going to share whether you have a favorite child?
Well, you know what? I'm going to save this.
Okay.
I'll save this for the rest
this
of
is
the
great.
pod.
Stay tuned, folks. It's coming up later in the podcast.
I was about to get
Jill was
real.
about to drop a bomb. Okay. Stay tuned.
And Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, we'll tell you about a Saturday morning of several years ago where people were led to believe a nuclear missile was headed towards the U.S. We'll explain what happened.
Okay, let's start with the war of words between President Trump and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy escalating on Wednesday. President Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator and said that he played former President Biden like a fiddle. Trump's comments came hours after Zelenskyy said that Trump had been caught in a web of disinformation from Russia over the war in Ukraine. The previous day, on Tuesday, Trump made a point of blaming Ukraine for the 3-year war with Russia and not successfully ending it. For the record, the war very clearly started when Russia amassed troops on Ukraine's border and then invaded the country back in February of 2022. The pointed exchange between Trump and Zelenskyy comes against the backdrop of the direct meetings that American and Russian officials had earlier this week on ending the war in Ukraine. that excluded the Ukrainian government. So in Kyiv right now, there's a lot of frustration over that. And now we've got this back and forth between Trump and Zelenskyy. Now, as for Trump's claim that Zelenskyy is a dictator, Zelenskyy was first elected the president of Ukraine back in 2019, and that election was considered fair by international observers. But his 5-year term ended last spring, and he postponed the 2024 election because of the war, and also the country was in martial law. Zelenskyy has vowed to finally hold a new election once the war ends.
Yeah, they went to martial law in 2022 as the Russians invaded, massive missile attacks on a daily basis. Zelenskyy and others around him view the idea of holding elections right now as practically impossible. More than a third of Ukraine's population is either under a Russian occupation or displaced internally, or in Europe, there's nearly 7 million Ukrainians who've left the country. So you have 20% of the country under Russian occupation. The daily attacks continue. And then I think the latest numbers I saw, Jill, 11 million Ukrainians are displaced. So when you look at those numbers in a country of about 40 million, he's like, we can't hold an election like this. And so that has now become one of the many sticking points the U.S. And Trump have with Zelenskyy.
So back to this war of words, you have Vice President J.D. Vance warning Zelenskyy against bad-mouthing Trump in an interview. And then Trump was also backed by other members of his team. But the bottom line here, this feud could complicate efforts to stop the war in Ukraine. And most of the bad blood between Trump and Zelenskyy actually started during Trump's first term.
Yeah, you got to go way back, because Zelenskyy was actually at the heart of Trump's first impeachment. Remember, there were 2 impeachments there during Trump's first term. There was an infamous phone call between the 2 men. Trump was trying to pressure Zelenskyy at the time to investigate Joe Biden, his likely 2020 opponent, and his son Hunter, and said basically, I'm going to withhold assistance for you unless you investigate my upcoming political opponent. Initially, Zelenskyy wasn't ready to do that. Then he did do that. Trump complimented him. That, of course, then led to Trump's first impeachment. Trump eventually said, I like Zelenskyy. He did what he needed to do. But now fast forward 4 years later, 3 years into the war, and Trump has already cut off Ukraine from aid over the course of the past several years. U.S. has given Ukraine $175 billion in financial and military assistance. Trump tries to throw the number around $300 billion or $400 billion. The numbers, as far as we have checked, is $175 billion. And he said, listen, Ukraine, if you want more aid from us, we want $500 billion with a B in your minerals and resources. Zelenskyy has not agreed to that. So there was that. Then there was the direct talks between the U.S. and Russia. Then there was Trump saying that, this war, Ukraine, you should have totally ended this war. And by the way, we think you're to blame for the fact that the Russians invaded you. Of course, Zelenskyy, as you mentioned, said you're caught up in disinformation. And then you had Trump say, well, you're a dictator and you played Biden like a fiddle. And so things really escalated in these last 48 hours here.
And then Zelenskyy wrote in his burn book that Trump, no, I'm just kidding.
No, but
that's what it feels like, Mean Girls, for anyone who didn't get that reference.
Listen, some people geopolitics, not that complicated. Sometimes it feels like high school. Sometimes it feels like middle school. Sometimes it feels like kindergarten. Now, there are major issues at stake here, right? The Russians occupy a significant portion of Ukraine. There are these talks. The 2 sides are far apart. You're going to need an agreement from Vladimir Putin, not someone anybody really trusts. And Zelenskyy and Ukraine, effectively, they're going to have to accept a reality where they're going to have to give up part of their country that Russia invaded and currently occupies in order to make a deal. And Trump, on top of that, has said, and by the way, you're not getting into NATO, and Europe's going to have to protect you, which is making them nervous about a potential future Putin invasion here. One of the things Trump brought up, by the way, is corruption. And we should note there has been corruption admitted to by the Ukrainian government. They've had to fire a bunch of people. There are accusations that there's billions of dollars missing from U.S. aid to Ukraine. So basically, Trump here going through a litany of some of the most vulnerable things of Ukraine right now, as he sort of plays both sides here and takes this neutral stance when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. And this is a shock to the system. I mean, not shocking if you listen to Trump on the campaign trail the last year, but now in implementation. In reality, going from a situation where the U.S. and Europe led this coalition to support Ukraine, and then effectively overnight, Trump comes in there. He's like, I'm done giving you guys aid. We're going to end this war. I don't care what you have to say about it. I'm not inviting you to the talks initially because I have my own game plan. I'll get you involved when I need you involved. So he's resetting the system, a shock to the system here. And so you see Zelenskyy not very comfortable with the reality here. And now the two of them going at it rhetorically.
Where is all the money that's been given? Where is it going? And I've never seen an accounting of it. We give hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't see any accounting. So I want to see peace. Look, you know why I want? Because I don't want all these people killed anymore. I'm looking at people that are being killed, and they're Russian and Ukrainian people, but they're people. Doesn't matter where they're from on the whole planet. And I think I have the power to end this war.
And not surprisingly, Democratic lawmakers have come out strongly against Trump's remarks, but even some Republicans are backing away from them as well. So on the Democratic side, you've got Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut calling Trump's recent comments about Zelenskyy utterly despicable, pathetic, and weak, not mincing words there. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
What world is he living in? It is not only contrary to the facts and the truth, but utterly despicable, a disgusting betrayal of a country that has bled and fought and died for freedom.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer saying those comments were straight from a Russian propaganda playbook. And again, even some Republican lawmakers are distancing themselves from Trump's comments, which is notable because so far in this second term, Republicans have been in lockstep. So you've got South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham said, when it comes to blame for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I blame Putin above all others. You've got Senate Majority Leader John Thune saying that there's no question that Russia's the aggressor here. And here's Trump ally Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana summing things up in the way he knows how.
To the extent that the White House said that Ukraine started the war, I disagree. I think Vladimir Putin started the war. I also believe, through bitter experience, that Vladimir Putin is a gangster. He's a gangster with a black heart. He makes Jeffrey Dahmer look like Mother Teresa. He has Stalin's taste for blood. I don't want to get between President Zelenskyy and President Trump. I never get between a dog and a fire hydrant, man. That's the way I live my life. I think they're both good men. I think they both want the same thing. And I think we will get there.
Most words to live by there.
Just for reference, John Kennedy, Louisiana, like he has these quotes, right? Makes Jeffrey Dahmer look like Mother Teresa, and asked about the dictator remark, goes, I'm not getting involved there. That's a fire hydrant and a dog, and they're both good people, and they're going to have to figure it out themselves. Who's
the fire hydrant and who's the dog? That's what I want to know.
I think in this case, Zelenskyy, given the way Zelensky's only the fire hydrant.
But Moshe, in all seriousness, Moshe, where does this leave things as President Trump is trying to get an end to this war?
Listen, this is going to be messy, and it's going to get messier before things get cleaned up. Trump's way of doing things are not the traditional diplomatic process, right? He shocks the system. He threatens tariffs. He launches tariffs. He talks about, clearing out 2 million people out of Gaza, the various things, forcibly buying Greenland, taking back the Panama Canal. We've been going over this stuff over the past month. And actually, we should note today, Jill, it's exactly a month since he was inaugurated. A lot has happened. So the process here is going to be messy. He's going to play the Ukrainians off the Russians. He's going to say, some things. He's going to play bad cop. He's going to play good cop. This is the deal here, but it makes folks queasy because ultimately, openly deriding an ally, a democracy, albeit a flawed democracy, but a democracy nonetheless, and calling Zelenskyy the dictator when in fact, Putin is the dictator, does not play well with Europe, does not play well with Democrats, and does not play well with a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill that are trying to find a way to politely criticize. I wouldn't even call those comments criticism, Jill. They're focused on their views, and when asked to opine on Trump, they avoid that because they know that comes with its own peril. But it's interesting because Putin, of all people, has been watching this for obvious reasons. And he actually did an interview on Russian television last night that I noticed where he actually said Trump needs to go harder on Europe and harder on Ukraine. He promised to get this done in 24 hours, and it's been longer than 24 hours. And he's not going to meet with Trump until Trump is ready for serious results. So you see Putin basically going at harder on Trump. He's like, no, you need to really tell the Ukrainians and the Europeans what's up, as the Ukrainians and Europeans are reeling from what is happening here. And as we talked about on the podcast this this week. This has real life ramifications. This is a game changer for Europe, going back to World War II in terms of expectations, the American security umbrella, a whole variety of things. And the Americans here are moving very fast. The Trump administration moving fast. And so, remains to be seen what happens today and the rest of the week as this thing quickly evolves. But again, the process you watch with Trump it's a process. It'll be messy. And very much, the people around him will say the ends will justify the means here. He has to approach things differently because the way things have gone until now have not worked.
So Putin might be overplaying his hand there.
if Trump needs to be more, Trump needs to go harder on the Europeans and the Ukrainians.
Is that possible? I don't know. And we wanted to do a quick reality check about air travel safety after a number of deadly incidents in recent weeks and that crash in Canada on Monday. A new poll finds Americans' confidence in air transportation and the federal agencies that are in charge of maintaining air safety has slipped a little bit from last year following that recent crash in Washington. The survey from the AP and NORC Center for Public Affairs Research shows that 64% of U.S. adults say that plane travel is very safe or somewhat safe, and that is down from 71%. And about 20% of U.S. adults say air transportation is very or somewhat unsafe, which is up from 12%. The poll was conducted shortly after that American Airlines passenger jet and an Army helicopter collided in Washington, killing 67 people. But before the Delta jet flipped on its roof while landing in Toronto. And then on Wednesday, 2 people were killed after 2 small aircraft collided midair at an Arizona airport just northwest of Tucson. And there are some other incidents as well that have drawn attention to air safety, including the crash of a medevac plane in Philadelphia and a plane that crashed near Nome, Alaska, killing 10 people. But Moshe, despite this string of negative headlines, we did want to walk through some of the numbers, which paint a better and different picture of safety in the skies.
Yeah, it's important to take a deep breath here and look at the facts, look at the numbers. Many of you have messaged me saying, please give me confidence in flying. I got to fly next week. And I'd like to remind you that your trip to the airport in the car is much more dangerous than the flight you're about to take. And as we look at all these crashes, despite the proximity and the dates here, all different causes, it appears. Now, they're all being investigated, but the DC collision, obviously, it appears the military chopper was not where it was supposed to be. In Canada, if you look at the video so far from earlier in the week, it appears to be potentially here pilot error or some major wind shear that led that plane to make a very hard landing. You see that they failed to bring the nose up of the plane, so they hit hard on the landing gear, which led to that situation. The Philadelphia case, a small Learjet that apparently had an issue right after takeoff and crashed immediately, just within a few hundred yards there of takeoff. So potentially major mechanical issue there or major pilot error. And then this latest crash, these 2 small planes, this collision in Arizona, this actually happened in a place they call an uncontrolled field, which actually does not have an operating air traffic control tower, especially when it comes to these smaller airports across the country. So pilots will often use a common traffic advisory frequency to announce their position if they're in the vicinity, but there tend to be more incidents when it comes to these very small planes. We tend not to notice them. They are statistically much more likely to experience things. The Delta situation and the American collision in DC, rare. If you look at it, you got to go back to 2009 for the last major commercial jet plane crash. So again, all these being investigated, but here are your numbers. In 2025 versus 2024, taking the first 6 weeks of the year, from January 1st to February 19th, this year, there have been 87 incidents, 85 people killed. Last year, in the same time period, 123 incidents. You just didn't hear about them. They were all very small planes, 42 people killed. So we've had about 40 less aviation accidents so far this year versus last year. The issue is you've had about double the deaths because of mainly that collision and crash in DC. So while, again, it seems right now that there are more and they're happening more frequently, we're actually down significantly in terms of the number of accidents. There's just been a couple high-profile situations. And just for context, you probably didn't know this because there was no major commercial jet crash last year. But in 2024, and these are mainly small planes, there were 1,400 aviation accidents. So you're basically talking about 4 to 5 incidents a day last year. 306 people died last year. Again, statistically here, typically very small planes, but just wanted to give you context again. Accidents actually down this year, even though the number of people killed up, specifically again because of the crash in DC.
Moshe, I know that you and Sari talked about this on the podcast yesterday. That meme you posted on Instagram saying, okay, it's now socially acceptable to clap when you land on the plane again.
Yes.
And I took a flight on Tuesday, and I have to tell you, there was a lot of turbulence, and everyone clapped when we landed, including me.
Listen, you got to give the props to the pilots. This is not easy, right? There's a reason why you and I stick to jobs that are land bound, that we don't take these big metal contraptions in the air, sometimes with hundreds of people. But major props to pilots out there. I was describing this to a friend yesterday when we were talking about this. I go, pilots are sort of like FBI agents and Secret Service. Like, they need to get it right 100% of the time. And when they don't get it right, whether they can't prevent a terrorist attack, whether, assassination attempts on the president, or in this case, crashes, we definitely hear about it. So they have to have a 100% record of success. And so there aren't many jobs that are like that. And so major props to, those of you who are listening in the aviation community or know people in that community, but both pilots, but also the flight attendants who successfully got all those people out of that Delta jet that was upside down on the runway there in Toronto. I should note, by the way, Jill, we learned late on Wednesday that Delta is offering passengers who were on that plane, all 76 of them, they're each getting $30,000. Delta is forking over about $2.3 million there. So not to say it was worth going through that incident.
I don't think so. For 30,000. I don't think that's worth it.
Unfortunately, I bet that'll get taxed too.
Right. So forget it. Definitely not worth it.
Not worth 30,000.
I thought you were gonna... 30
million. Maybe we're talking.
I thought you were going to say they were offering them unlimited flights, like for the rest of their lives. And I'm thinking, no, don't give. They don't want to fly Delta again.
I don't know. First class, business class, towards my left. That would be super nice, Delta. I think they deserve it.
Okay, so that's our recommendation. If anyone from Delta is listening, get rid.
Delta, 30,000. That's it. That's all you can do for these poor people who were left hanging upside down and had to escape a burning plane.
All right, time for the speed read from the New York Times. President Trump revoking federal approval of New York City's controversial congestion pricing program. His goal is to reverse the policy that tolls drivers up to $9 each time they enter downtown and midtown Manhattan, some of the busiest streets in the city. The tolling program is designed to help raise millions in critical infrastructure funding and also to decrease traffic in Manhattan's most congested zones, pushing people to take public transportation. In a letter to New York Governor Kathy Hochul, the president's transportation secretary, Sean Duffy, outlined his objections to the program. He cited the cost to working class drivers, the use of revenue from the tolls for transit upgrades instead of roads, and the scope of the plan compared to the federal legislation that authorized it. The letter, though, didn't indicate a specific date by which the federal government intended to end the program. State and city authorities have already filed a lawsuit challenging the decision with the goal of keeping the toll.
Yeah, they're suing so they can keep the toll alive. This has been very controversial in New York City, Jill, even among people who understand the goals here, who understand how nasty the subway is, in need of upgrades, various things this would go to, annoyed about congestion and traffic. But nonetheless, $9 each time you got to go to that part of the city. Now, this has been tried and has been effective internationally in a number of cities around the world, New York being the first major U.S. city to try this out. But Trump says no. Like, this is not something I want to see. It also comes against a political backdrop where in New York, he gained voters this election. New York obviously still went overwhelmingly Democrat, but he finished the best a Republican has in nearly 4 decades since the Reagan administration and Bush 41 in New York. So he's like, maybe I can do something for my old city. He writes on True Social the following. This is Trump. Congestion pricing is dead. Manhattan, all of New York is saved. All caps. Long live the king! Exclamation point. Assumption there, he's referring to himself as the king. That was reinforced later, Jill, with an Instagram post that his team posted on the White House official account, which now has memes during the Trump administration, with a cover AI version of Trump looking like Time Magazine, but they renamed Time Magazine Trump Magazine. It's a photo of Trump wearing a crown with the headline, "Long Live the King." Allies are laughing. Some voters told me who voted for him, like, it feels a little anti-American to call yourself the king, given our history. We literally launched a revolution against a king, and George Washington refused to be a king. And then, of course, Democrats outraged here, given the anger it caused. You can imagine we'll be hearing more of the king talk coming up, just as a provocative thing. Nonetheless, New York Governor Kathy Hochul, not among those laughing about this. She replied, "We are a nation of laws, not ruled by a king." The MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, has initiated legal proceedings to preserve this critical program. See you in court. For those of you familiar with New York, this basically affects everything south of 60th Street in Manhattan. And since January 5th, most drivers have been paying $9 to get into the city. And this is the area that includes Times Square, the Empire State Building, the World Trade Center. And again, the hope was to raise money here, create less congestion and gridlock. And that's the goal. And so far, the numbers have shown that foot traffic is up, vehicle traffic is down, ridership of buses and subways is up. So New York authorities were liking this. Most New Yorkers didn't love this. Trump's coming in. He's the king of New York now, Jill.
Look, where I live in the burbs, congestion pricing was highly unpopular. So are you guys saying long live the king? I think some people might be, actually.
Actually, given certain parts of Long Island, people are absolutely, those posters are being made.
Okay, now to the Middle East from Reuters. Egypt's President al-Sisi is expected to travel to Saudi Arabia today, all to talk about an Arab plan for Gaza. It could include up to $20 billion from the region for reconstruction. As we have talked about here on the podcast, President Trump shocked the Arab world last month by suggesting that the nearly 2 million Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip leave the area, which would then be taken over by the United States and rebuilt. That idea was universally condemned by the Arab world, to which President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, okay, then come up with a better idea, which is perhaps what they're trying to do.
So you're going to have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, that includes Abu Dhabi and Dubai. The Qataris all will be reviewing this new Arab plan in Saudi Arabia before it's presented at a all-Arab summit. That's set to take place early next month in Cairo. Now, this is mainly an Egyptian plan so far. It involves forming a national Palestinian committee to govern Gaza without Hamas. Remember, most of the Arab rulers hate Hamas. Hamas is frustrating to them, and they want them out. That's sort of one of the unifying things in the region right now is nobody likes Hamas, except for maybe Iran and a handful of others. Turkey's also been sympathetic to them.
And American college students.
A few American college students, yes, Jill, who've been waving the flags, but the Arab leaders there, they can't stand them. This has been frustrating to them. This has set back the Palestinian cause and, frankly, Gaza by decades. And so right now you have the rulers there finding a strategy they hope will ensure that Trump doesn't follow through with his plan to displace all 2 million plus Palestinians from Gaza and build what he says is the new Riviera of the Middle East that will serve the purposes of all the world's people in various things that he has said recently. Now, there's a belief that between these countries, they'll get together and make a $20 billion contribution towards a fund. And they hope that that'll show seriousness and also get Trump on board here. The goal overall, put together a viable plan that shows the U.S. that the Arabs will take lead here in rebuilding Gaza, or at least, significantly contribute to it. And that was one of the goals here. We told you about it, as much as, again, it was a shock to hear Trump say things like, we're going to displace everybody and just take control of Gaza. People around him were saying this is the way that he approaches things. He was trying to light a fire under them. And so that's the deal. Now, Easier said than done. Getting Hamas out of there is going to be super challenging. Who's going to do that? Ultimately, really the only military in there that's had any success doing that and has experience doing that and is willing to do that is the Israelis. It'd be a very complex situation for the Arab countries to send in their own militaries to fight Hamas and remove Hamas. So there's a lot of challenges here, and we'll watch what happens.
And Moshe, we also want to mention that expected to be released Thursday as part of the ceasefire hostage deal, the bodies of Shiri, Bibas, and her 2 young children, Ariel and Kafir. Now, that transfer will likely have happened by the time you listen to this podcast as we record on Wednesday evening. Those 2 boys, who would now be 5 and 2 years old, were the youngest hostages.
Just tragic. You've probably seen their pictures, heard their stories. For Israelis, for many Jews around the world, for folks closely watching this story, they really came to symbolize this conflict. Innocent children, a baby, taken hostage on October 7th. And it's expected to be a very painful day for many folks.
To business news from CNN, KFC, the fast food chain formerly known as Kentucky Fried Chicken, is leaving the state where it all began. The chicken chain's parent company, Yum Brands, announced this week that KFC's corporate headquarters is leaving Kentucky for Texas, joining sister brand Pizza Hut's offices in the Dallas suburb of Plano. It is a notable change for the 95-year-old company that got its start at a motel in a small Kentucky town, thrusting the state's name into one of the most iconic chains. They now have 30,000 restaurants across 150 countries. The relocation is part of Yum's broader plans to have just 2 U.S. headquarters for its restaurants, which also includes Taco Bell and Habit Burger. The company says combining KFC's offices with Pizza Hut will foster greater collaboration among brands and employees.
Jill, you go anywhere in the world and, that's what people know about Kentucky. They've heard of Kentucky through Kentucky Fried Chicken, sort of for many years as a Chicagoan. If you went to many places around the world, they knew us for Al Capone and Michael Jordan. So it's always interesting traveling around the world and be like, what do you know about my town? And it's always just a couple kind of pop culture iconic things. Of course, the story of Colonel Sanders is very well known. As you laid out, he started at a roadside stand there in Corbin, Kentucky. Now, KFC says it's not completely abandoning its birthplace. It has plans for what it calls a first of its kind flagship restaurant set to be built in Louisville. But the departure here angering Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who said in a statement that he's disappointed by the decision and said that he believes if he was still alive, Colonel Sanders would be disappointed as well. He continues, the company's name starts with Kentucky and has marketed our state's heritage and culture in the sale of its product. My hope is the company is going to rethink this, especially moving Kentucky Fried Chicken employees out of Kentucky. But a lot of people are headed to Texas. We talked last week about Y'all Street as more finance companies go down there. And there's a stock exchange open down there. But there's a parade of companies headed to Texas. You got Chevron, Tesla, as well as Elon Musk's SpaceX. Hewlett-Packard has made a move recently. You're hearing about a variety of companies, and now KFC that have moved to Texas. In this case, they're talking about business-friendly regulations, tax breaks. Though they are coming from a red state here, this appears to be more about efficiency for Yum Brands.
From NBC News, President Trump signed an executive order directing his administration to explore ways to make in vitro fertilization, or IVF, more affordable for American families. The order sets a 90-day deadline for his team to give him policy recommendations aimed at reducing patient costs associated with IVF treatment, which can be tens of thousands of dollars. Nearly 8 million children in the U.S. have been born via IVF. It accounts for about 2% of births in this country. On the campaign trail, IVF emerged as a major issue in the wake of a controversial Alabama State Supreme Court ruling. Trump referred to himself as the father of IVF and promised that all families seeking the treatment would have coverage. He said in August, your government will pay for, or your insurance company will be mandated to pay for all costs associated with IVF treatment.
Yeah, big promises there from Trump. So we'll see what they come back with. Again, this is a very preliminary executive order. This tells his team, hey, come research some ways and come back to me with some recommendations. Then, of course, the question will be, what comes next? Now, Democrats have called this a PR stunt, saying, hey, we've proposed legislation on Capitol Hill, literally saying, let's find a way to fund IVF and help families with IVF. And Republicans on Capitol Hill have voted against it. In some cases, have blocked it. So in this case, if Trump is actually serious here, he's going to need congressional support because, remember, they have to allocate funds here. Estimates are that covering IVF for all Americans, either by requiring insurance companies to do it they'll push back on that, or having the government do it will cost at least $7 billion a year, probably more. The average round of IVF can cost $15,000, $20,000. Some of you have said $50,000 or more, depending on how many runs you go through and where you're doing it. So ultimately here, Trump is going to have to face off with his own wing. Trump is going to have to face off with a wing of the Republican Party. There's got the social conservative wing that has issues with destroying embryos, believing that even an embryo is a life. The Catholic Church opposes the procedure. So you have sort of the religious conservatives there. And then, of course, you have sort of the fiscal conservatives. They'll be opposed to just spending money on something like that. So we'll see what happens. Right now, insurance coverage very inconsistent. Some large companies offer support for IVF, but the vast majority of employers in the U.S. do not. But a first step here. I know many of you are watching it closely.
And finally, from the Washington Post, for all the parents out there, deny it all you want, but you probably have a favorite child. A recent study reveals that it often has to do with things you can't control. Gender and birth order. The study found that parents, both mothers and fathers, tend to favor daughters and first children. The study's author said it was surprising because there are a couple of older studies that suggest fathers favor sons and mothers favor their daughters. So that is what they were expecting to find. But it turns out even fathers favor their daughters as well. Of course, no one outright admitted to it. Researchers instead asked parents questions like, do you experience more conflict with one child? Who do you spend the most time with? Who gets more help with homework? Parents also reported more favoritism toward their most conscientious and agreeable children.
Yeah, as the father of a 17-month-old girl talking to boy parents, I often hear about boy energy versus girl energy, especially at that young age. Olivia sits nicely in the circle and the boys are kind of jumping all over the place in the various classes that we've taken her to. Now we should note more on the study here. The study was not designed to make parents feel guilty, but to highlight discrepancies in parenting that they say could affect a child's mental health, development, and academic success. One way to avoid perceived favoritism is being explicit about why a certain child gets more attention, such as needing extra support with schoolwork or having a medical condition. So jealousy doesn't get created there. So, it doesn't feel like, well, you always favor one child, but explaining why certain actions are happening or certain attention is being given. The study's author saying in an article, even if you feel it's legitimate, if the kids don't understand that and don't buy into that, it could still have negative effects. There are some benefits to being an older child. Older siblings are given more freedom, more autonomy. And so that leads the older children to typically be more mature and responsible. And that's even true as adults, with adult children, giving more freedom to your older kids, which, Jill, we have now waded into this podcast. We're nearly at the end here. At the beginning, we asked, here's the question, find a way to answer this in a way that'll stand the test of time when your kids are old enough to listen to this podcast. February 20th, 2025, everybody, mark it down. Grayson, Alex, here's your mom's answer.
Okay. So my daughter is 6.5. My son is 2.5. Okay. My daughter has been around. I've had her in my life for three times as long as my son. I obviously love them both unconditionally. So at this point in my life, I do understand the concept, right? Eventually it evens out, and that's a nominal difference in time. But I guess my daughter, I hate to say it, I if I'm being honest, I feel like she does have a
the
bigger
eldest daughter
piece
thing.
Of, yes, I have devoted so much more in way to her. And not only that, there's such a big difference in their development at this point where she's really a person, and I can now have the real conversations with her versus my son, who is still a toddler. So I hope that holds up, but we're
going to do this story every 3 years for the next 20, and we'll see if it holds up once they become teenagers, once they go off to college. But I totally get it. I mean, also as I'm a first-time parent, have an eldest daughter, God willing, there'll be more kids in the future. But I get it. It's that first child also just changes your life in such a way, and it's such a demarcation point. So I understand why, people might reflect in that way. They also grow up before the other ones. So you tend to rely on them before the other ones. So there's certain, again, middle children, younger children, etc. Certain things you can't control. about, when you came into your parents' lives and that sort of thing. But fascinating nonetheless how they tried to get at this information.
But Moshe, I am a younger sibling. Okay, so you're the older sibling and you have a brother, but I'm the younger. And I think my parents love me more, right? No, I'm just kidding. They do listen to this podcast every day.
They do. Your brother doesn't. So great. That works.
Mom and Dad just admit it. Scott will never know. No, I'm just kidding.
All right, let's get to On This Day in History here. Museum history in New York. On this day in 1872, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York opened to the public, becoming one of the foremost museums in the world. On this day in 1959, some of you might know this if you're Jimi Hendrix fans, a 16-year-old Jimi Hendrix made his debut with an unnamed band at a synagogue in Seattle. So 16-year-old Jimi Hendrix performs at Temple de Hirsch Sinai in Seattle. He had just bought himself a guitar for $5 and learned to play. But that is where Jimmy would perform on stage for the first time.
At a service? Or
I don't know details. It was at a synagogue. It's unclear if it was related to a holiday, a Sabbath service, but now I want to dig into this further. All right, this is what I mentioned at the top. On this day in 1971, the U.S. emergency broadcast system was mistakenly activated in an erroneous national alert that would be used in a nuclear attack. So you might have been up. You might remember this if you were up at about 9:30 a.m. Saturday morning, February 20th, 1971. Apparently, the two tapes, the one for the test and the actual emergency, were hanging side by side where the teletype operator was. And so apparently it was a Saturday morning. The person who went to go grab the test tape grabbed the wrong tape. And so ultimately, for a brief moment there on a Saturday morning in 71, we thought a nuclear attack was happening. This was a test, only a test. Jill, a little Seinfeld history for you. We haven't done this in a while. On this day in 1997, the episode The Pothole aired for the first time. This is the storyline in which the character Kramer adopts a stretch of an expressway and decides to make the lanes comfier for the drivers.
I do sometimes think about that on some of the roads that are very tight, like the belt, like the BQE, for example, in New York, worst road ever. Mm-hmm. It would be nice to have a little more room.
He was onto something, eliminating a line of paint there and creating a very big lane. All right, a bit of music history for you as we end here. On this day in 1988, happy birthday, Rihanna. Rihanna turns 37 today. Robin Rihanna Fenty, born in Barbados. At 16, she's discovered and helps land a deal with Jay-Z's label Def Jam at the time. And keeping with musical birthdays, Kurt Cobain was born on this day. And we should mention Olivia Rodrigo, also a birthday on this day. So you have a good shot if you're born on this day of being very musically talented or performing at a synagogue in Seattle.
We need the backstory immediately.
I'll work on it. All
right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Welcome back, Jill. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.